how many of you were here on Tuesday? Oh, okay. There's lots of new people, so I'm going to have to repeat a little bit of what I said on Tuesday, but don't worry, it's only, I think, about 80% is going to be new. So, yeah, so this evening we are going to talk about phenomenon of development-induced displacement, which is growing dynamic all over the world. And I'm going to, so the lecture is going to be in two parts. One is we're going to look at standards that have been developed which can be used to counter displacement. And also a tool that has been developed to measure the impact of displacement. Now, most of you understand when we say development-induced displacement, sort of have an idea of what that is? Development and market-based. Can we have some examples? What do you understand by that? Go ahead.
Large real estate projects or agro-industrial projects or anything that is given the green light from on high that ends up displacing people who may not have been informed or may not have participated in those decisions.
Yeah, great, yes. What else? What other types of projects?
Actually, a lot with urban renewal projects.
Right.
In the US in the 60s.
Great, great. What else? Market-based solutions. Those are the property market, housing market, speculation, and property. Yeah, so those are the types of issues I'm talking about. These types of evictions, in the ones that all of you have mentioned, but there are also evictions because of city beautification, changes in land use, there are evictions because of slum clearance drives, evictions because of mineral extraction in rural areas. So a range of reasons why development-based displacement takes place, so-called development-based. And the figures are really striking. I think we have to get a sense of the scale of the problem. We're talking about hundreds and thousands of people being displaced every year. One figure that was computed in 2005 when I was rapporteur, we did a very rough exercise, showed that the number of people being displaced because of these types of projects around the world exceeded annually the number of people displaced because of armed and ethnic conflict. Which is quite a striking number. And it was very clear that these types of evictions, we have to characterize them as human tragedies, because more often than not, people are left homeless, they're left landless, they're left without access to livelihood, and without access to legal or other remedies. And also, what is very striking is that these types of evictions and displacement, we can close. Discrimination plays a very critical role in these types of evictions. So they mostly affect ethnic, religious, racial, other minorities. Indigenous people are, way disproportionately more affected around the world because of these types of evictions. Women are particularly impacted as a result of evictions, and as a consequence not just of losing the home, but also livelihoods, relationships, support systems that women are used to, breakdown of kinship ties, physical and psychological trauma, and even figures show increased morbidity and mortality. But what is very striking also is that almost all of these types of evictions have common features. There's certain, things that bind them in a negative sense, but I don't know, can you think of, so these types of evictions that we're talking about, can you think of what would be in common? I mean, they're clearly human rights violations, they're clearly leaving people worse off. what do they have in common? They occur because of different reasons, but
I'm gonna cheat because I heard you say this on Tuesday. Violence, using violence in an actual eviction.
okay, yeah, that's right. What else?
I guess, a big process issue in evictions is lack of influence or incorporation in decision making that leads to eviction.
So lack of participation of people and, okay, yeah, very good. Anyone else? So there's violence, there's lack of information, so that means that most of these occur without prior notice, little or no consultation. Some of them occur with not even a 1 hour notice. They occur sometimes in the middle of the night, when it's raining, sometimes when it's, the children's exams are going on. So they can be quite devastating in their impact. And there are few of any human rights safeguards for people who are affected by these types of evictions. So the response, of course, around the world, at the national level, there are campaigns, there are movements, there are people who are finding very innovative, creative ways to resist evictions. Many projects have been stopped by just, people's action, or blocking roads, having demonstrations, doing a lot of advocacy with the media. But the overwhelming majority of these projects are not, are difficult to stop. They're going ahead at a very, very fast pace. So in 2004, when I was working at the UN, we decided that what was really needed were some global standards, some operational guidelines that could inform municipalities and others what is it that you need to do, not only to prevent evictions, but if displacement has to happen, what kind of human rights safeguards you have to put into place before, during, and after displacement. So we, after a 4-year study of good practices around the world of how to articulate the human rights that did exist, including the right to adequate housing and other rights, we came up with an instrument called the Basic Principles and Guidelines on Development-Based Displacement and Evictions. And I'm just going to run you through the main features of these guidelines, what kind of an instrument it offers. And as I said, it's an operational instrument, so it's something that gives you a step-by-step instruction on what needs to be done. So I'm just going to run through that. So there's, let me do that. So the idea of the guidelines was to, it says to assist governments in developing law and policy, to hold the government accountable for the violations that happen if they do occur, to ensure practical steps to ensure the rights that people have, not only to housing but sorry, yes.
I'm sorry, are these actions normally legal? Let's say in the law of the countries where they are
Right.
taken, or are they legal or not?
Some are and some are not.
Okay, there's no.
There's no constant. But actually, even where they are legal, we have to question that notion of legality because it doesn't take into account the human rights of the people.
I think that even when they are legal, it's easier to put such a standard than if they are illegal.
Yes,
If they are
yes.
legal, it's easier to.
But what the standards call for is that there has to be a review of all national law and policy to see that if it's consistent with the country's human rights obligations. In many places we have found that there are national laws in existence that even contradict the country's own constitution. Right. So there's a process underway to amend the laws to do away with the laws as well. So, but this is a very good question because it's a big question of who determines legality, and on what basis is legality defined. Right? So, so the purpose is, of course, also to to reduce evictions. The guidelines actually don't say that, you may have heard some civil society groups taking a position that there should never be any evictions. Right? The guidelines don't say that. I think they say that the eviction should be in exceptional circumstances, and I'll come back to that, what those circumstances are. And of course, those exceptional circumstances have to be consistent with human rights standards. So these guidelines, that's just a thing, they were presented in 2007. So since that time, they were accepted by the highest intergovernmental human rights body in the United Nations, the Human Rights Council, and so since then they've been accepted as global standards. I'll come back to how the guidelines can be used, but I first wanted to run you through what it says, what they say. So the exceptional circumstances are for the promotion of general welfare. Now, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more afterwards because that's another issue that can be questioned. You know, when a government says something is being done for the public good or for public purpose, whose public, you know, which public's good and which public purpose needs to be questioned. So that actually relates to what you were saying about legal and illegal as well. Of course, to promote health and well-being. So there are many communities and people who are living in health and life-threatening conditions. People are living along riversides, on hill, on denuded hillsides. They're living along railway tracks. They're living in waterlogged areas that consistently get flooded. So there are people who actually, and the guidelines establish a right to resettle. So if you're living in those conditions, you should have the right to be moved, right? And to have a much better housing, to have much better living conditions. And of course, it says it should be authorized by law, but this law refers to human rights law, not any other kind of law. And of course, the premise of the guidelines is that most countries in the world, the overwhelming majority, have ratified international instruments that protect these rights. So they bear the obligation to respect rights. And of course, the guidelines are saying it's not only the obligation of the states, but also of non-state actors. I mean, some of the examples you were all giving, many times evictions happen because of what multinational companies do, or sometimes what landlords do on their own. So it's not only the governments. The governments have the obligation to control that, to regulate that, but there are also non-state actors. Some of the evictions happen because of World Bank policies. Some of them happen because of regional bank policies, and so they all have an obligation. So these guidelines are based on, I think you may all be familiar with, these are just basic human rights principles that are globally accepted. So every action that is taken has to comply with these principles. Do you want me to go into each one of these, or you're sort of generally familiar with? I think you are. And what the guidelines do is they yeah, so there are basic principles which are foundational principles of human rights that the first obligation on municipalities and states is to protect the human rights of the most vulnerable, right? And for those vulnerable groups that are threatened with evictions, who may not have legal rights to where they are, that they have to be given those rights. I mentioned the right to resettlement. Also, that people have to have access to legal and other remedies. What the guidelines also do is they attempt to define what is a forced eviction. So, what is it that would qualify as an eviction? I'm not going to read that out. We'll make these PowerPoints available, so if you want to take notes. So the type of evictions we're talking about, we already mentioned: infrastructure projects, urban renewal, slum upgradation. A big thing now, which has been there for some time, are mega events. We had the Commonwealth Games in Delhi 2010. Rio is already there are already evictions taking place in Rio in preparation for the World Cup and the Olympics. And there are other types of development-based evictions. But again, the guidelines, this is the first time that the UN has actually mentioned and accepted that the notion of market-based evictions. This is something that you're familiar with in this country, but it's happening all over the world where people are being evicted because of speculation, because of creation of large projects, because of the mortgage market, because of privatization of services, unsustainable rent increases. People who are even on Social Security cannot manage to pay, so the rents are too high, so they get evicted. And there's a lot of documentation now which shows that these types of violations, these type of evictions constitute violations of a range of human rights. So it's not only housing, it's not only health, it's inhuman and degrading treatment. It's directly attacks the security of the person and the home. And we were talking earlier about what are the impacts. One of the more recently documented impact is that if these types of evictions continue, we are going to have more and more social conflict because people are getting, cities are becoming segregated, people are getting, removed from their sources of livelihood, and there is a lot of civic unrest because of that. As I mentioned, they affect the poorest and most marginalized sectors, leave people homeless, destitute. They result in physical and psychological injuries which need to be documented, and that's the second part of the presentation. I'm going to talk about that. The guidelines actually begin, the substantive part begins by looking at what are the preventative measures that states can take. What kind of measures can be taken in law, in planning, in administrative strategies that can reduce and prevent evictions, including it's very clear that governments now have to intervene in the market to bring down speculation. If that is not done, there's going to be more and more evictions. So before a project begins, as I said, the guidelines are in three parts: before, during, and after. They list what needs to be done. So the first step that has to take place is there has to be an eviction impact assessment. You've all heard of environmental impact assessments. That's now a very common part of large projects. But ironically, social and eviction impact assessments are not. They're not a mandatory part of a project. And so these guidelines call for that, that they have to take place they have to be done at different stages of the eviction process. That data has to be disaggregated. But I'm going to go into much more detail on this, so I'll just quickly run through the next few slides on what type of eviction impact assessments have to take place. And then the guidelines say that, as we were mentioning earlier, that most often there is no notice, so there has to be appropriate notice. And there has to be an exploration of alternatives. Again, many studies around the world now show that in most places you don't need to build large dams. In most places you don't need to have in cities large infrastructure projects that displace a lot of people. That projects can be designed in a different manner. You can have a different thinking of how cities should grow and what kind of priorities there should be. And very important is that in this search for alternatives, is involvement of the people. Remember one of the things we were saying before is that there's very little consultation. So if you involve people, actually, again, there are examples around the world where people can, working with planners, with NGOs, people can come up with alternatives for how their community should grow and how to minimize displacement. So other steps that need to be taken is relevant information, and that the obligation should be on the government to demonstrate that the evictions are unavoidable. Not on people to say, no, don't do it, but it's actually the obligation of the state Obviously following democratic procedure, that there should be public hearings. There should be the information should be something that people can understand in local languages, very visibly displayed in different places, and of course, if it is determined after going through all that process and having prior and informed consent of the community, then the resettlement has to be ready before people are evicted. What happens right now is people are being displaced and moved to a site, very often 30, 40 kilometers from where they were, and then slowly the infrastructure comes up, and sometimes it doesn't. There is no infrastructure for decades. There are examples where people are just dumped in a place and left there to fend for themselves. And then of course there are steps that have to be taken during evictions to avoid violence, to avoid other types of problems that arise very often. Very basic principles are that they should not happen in bad weather at night, during festivals, during school examinations. One of the worst impacts has been on children. There are children who lose up to a year of school because they leave home in the morning and go to school and come back and there's no home. Everything is destroyed. So there is there have to be some, there have to be these very strict rules. And of course, after an eviction, there should be sufficient compensation, and the compensation has actually to be based on the eviction impact assessment that has been done before. Not right now. What happens is even the few people who are compensated, it's very arbitrary. So up to the local authorities, how much, if they give compensation and what type of compensation. Of course, this has to be treated as a humanitarian situation, so there should be safe access to food, water, medical services. There should be great care taken that communities are not separated. What happens very often now is communities are split apart. And of course, you remember this principle we talked about, gender equality, so there has to be great care taken that women are involved in all the planning processes. And then if it's not done in the manner in which specified, there have to be remedies, there have to be access to legal aid, and then compensation. I'm running through some of this because I'll come back to the compensation part in more detail. And essentially the principle in the guidelines is that you have to base everything on the dignity of the individual, right? So even if they didn't hold titles, even if they did not have legal rights, they have to be compensated as if they did. So, and if say a farmer lost land, then they should be given back land of commensurable or better quality rather than just cash, because that doesn't help. It very quickly impoverishes a family. And then what I mentioned to you before about the resettlement. So there's a lot of detail in the guidelines on what type of resettlement, rehabilitation, what is the criteria for that. What type of, people have to be, very often now when people are displaced, they even have to pay for their own travel to go to the new site. There is, as you said, there is no notice. So even after running through all the processes that we talked about earlier, of consultation, hearings, the guidelines say that there should be at least a 90-day notice. Even though development-based displacement, it's different from displacement because of conflict, ethnic armed conflict, but still there are situations where people are removed from their homes and lands, and if what the government says should happen has not happened, they should actually be allowed to go back to their homes. So it's just there's a lot more detail. We can give you the website where the guidelines are. I think I have it here, and if you want to take a look. They've now been translated into 19 languages. They're being used by some municipalities, by civil society groups. They've been cited in court. They've been used as a basis for court judgments, and as a form of human rights education as well. So they are now being increasingly used, and certainly planners, architects, others who are involved in determining how cities grow can use them, and they can become very useful for mobilizing national and international campaigns, and mostly for holding governments accountable. That was part one. Okay. Are there any questions, or we can take a little break and have some questions, and then I'll come to the more technical part. So you have spoken. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering, a lot of these guidelines may be helpful in campaigns, but we focus a lot on what should happen and what would be the right way to go about things, but I don't necessarily see how they would force local governments or governments to take such action and make this happen. And I mean, has there been any specific project that you can cite where these guidelines have been used to successfully stop a project from happening? I mean, what is it really that prevents such projects from being stopped in the first place? What's that connection?
Well, the guidelines are, they're new, they're just a few years old, but already we have seen that there are, as I mentioned to you, there are several court cases where the guidelines were used as a basis of delivering the judgment that the eviction should be stayed or stopped. One in Nairobi, several cases in Delhi, and they have been used. In India, there's a new draft law on resettlement and rehabilitation at a national level, which is in the parliament. So that it incorporates the notion of the guidelines that there should be a social impact assessment. And they are, of course, being used very widely by civil society groups in mobilizing against evictions, in providing education to municipalities. It's a bit early to say how, but like other standards, I'll give you one more example. I think some of you may have heard of the UN guidelines on internal displacement, internally displaced peoples. So those have been around for a long time, but over time they have become, they've been incorporated into national law, they've been incorporated into national policies, they're used as a basis for determining whether projects should be funded by bilateral and other agencies. So it's a sort of a work in progress, and it needs to be a lot more advocacy and other work needs to be done for them to be more widely used. But of course, you're right to say that it's, you're swimming against the current, right? It's not, that's a wider issue where we need to discuss the political and economic dimensions of how nations are progressing, and that's the larger question. Unless we're able to challenge that, it is difficult to stop a lot of evictions. But the idea is to, even if you cannot stop it, at least to humanize the process.
And does the UN sort of have a role in calling out, giving bold statements on particular projects happening around the world?
Yes, absolutely. The special rapporteurs are doing that, parts of the UN are doing that. I did it when I was rapporteur. I was repeatedly issuing public statements against large-scale development projects. Some we were able to stop. So that is a regular part of it. And again, in that kind of work, if you have standards to refer to, that's very helpful. Say to the government, not only stop it, but if you are going ahead, do it according to, this kind of stuff. Sorry, you are.
I had a similar question about whether or not they were binding, and it sounds like they're not. But then I'm also kind of curious. It sounds like a lot of, particularly for the process post-eviction, it's asking a lot of both physical capital and also in terms of time and human capital to facilitate this process and then provide resettlement options that are adequate and have access to all of these services, when I'm assuming many of these communities didn't have access to those services even before eviction. So I'm wondering about the responsibility for that financial burden and that time burden, because I'm assuming most of these projects are taking place in municipalities that are already suffering from lack of public funds, which is maybe the reason that they're pushing for these
Yeah,
projects in the
exactly.
first place, and that's kind of the catch-22 that I keep getting stuck in.
Yeah, that's true, but see, there are two things you said which are not entirely accurate. One is that many of the people who are evicted, I can give you many examples, we're actually better off before eviction than after.
I'm
Right.
sure. I'm wondering about if this were to happen in its full extent, where
Right.
people are to be provided land, particularly farmers,
Yeah, the
things
cost,
like that.
yes, yes. So the second part is that, again, data and calculations have shown that in many cases, it actually is cheaper for the municipality to upgrade people where they're living, particularly regarding slums, than to remove them. The cost of eviction is very, very high. And that's something else we are going to come to now when I talk about the impact assessment. So, and if the authorities do have human rights obligations and they're accountable to that, then of course the cost has to be built in, whatever the cost is. That cannot be an excuse for violating people's rights. So it's part of so if you have a project, now for example, it's very common for all large scale projects to have a cost component built in for eviction impact, for environmental impact assessment. Right? So no one questions that anymore. Like, where did the money come from? How did you get, there are institutional setups, there are consultants. Why shouldn't the same be for social impact assessment? So that's part of the argument that money has to be made available. But in most cases, there are funds for that, and even civil society groups are willing to help, institutions are willing to help. But it's a question of the government being open to that.
I think you mentioned that there needs to be more efficacy work done in order for these principles to be more widely used. If I ask just one step further on that, so what are the top 3 things perhaps that's preventing these principles from being more widely used, beyond just saying more efficacy needs to be done? And within those 3 things, what then needs to happen for those obstacles to be overcome?
Well, there are more than 3 things, but let me try to produce 3.
Just asking for the top
Yes,
3,
right.
I know there are just a long
Um,
list of things.
One is that, which we continuously run up against with governments, is that they're still not willing to accept that these are human rights issues. They see it as part of a natural development process. They see it as part of, if countries have to advance, like in my country, in India, the argument is, well, we need to build world-class cities, so that means a certain number of people have to be evicted. That's okay, we look after them, but so the paradigm is, so it's not thought of as a rights issue. The second is that there isn't an understanding of the damage that is caused. Right? There isn't sensitivity to that. Let me put it that way. So governments will go ahead and evict and worry about the consequences later. They will not. The third is that there's a lot to be gained by evicting people. If you clear a slum of 1,000, 10,000 families, there are large slums that are cleared, and you use that land for shopping malls, entertainment complexes, imagine the revenue to be gained. And that is very closely tied to the levels of corruption around the world. Right? So everybody gains from that. Politicians gain, the developers gain. So I mean, you have to be able to counter that politically and legally. So those are some of the obstacles. But there is a growing movement. It's in a way the same obstacles that we have to getting other types of even very serious human rights violations recognized. I mean, you've all heard the recent debate on rape, women's rights. I mean, even to get that recognized, because there is a sort of a mindset that says, the patriarchal mindset, right? So similarly, there's a ideological mindset that says that they don't say it explicitly, the policymakers, but the thinking is that there has to be a level of sacrifice. I mean, that some people have to suffer. And that's what has to be countered. And one way of countering it is to document, is to say these are the kinds of violations taking place, take the issue to court, to name the officials that are responsible, to have some people prosecuted for deliberate actions that are violating these rights. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and there are many groups now working on this issue. But one of the aspects we are missing, and that's what I want to focus on in the second part of the presentation, is that we still don't have a good sense of how much damage is done by these evictions. What is the material impact? What is the psychological impact? We don't have good figures. We don't have good data. We don't have we don't have a mapping. We have really good mapping of conflict, right? Population movements, refugee movements, establishment of internally displaced people's camps, but we don't have that for these type of evictions. We don't have that type of GIS data, or we don't have, and that's one of the aspects that one of the reasons I came here also. I'm sort of interested in having an institution like the MIT take up something like that and saying, look, we'll contribute. And Professor Rajagopal is working on the Eviction Action Network. And so that's all part of the thinking, that we need much more work, much more technical work. We have a very solid human rights-based legal basis right now. We have very strong arguments, but we don't have what we need is the accompanying data.
So is there any, I know you said you don't have a formal mapping system, but is there any kind of strong notion of where people go? Let's say you evict an entire slum. Do they reform an informal community elsewhere, or do they integrate into pre-existing slums, or what normally happens?
There are different types of movements. Some of the evictions that I was talking about, when a large slum is evicted, they are, some people are offered resettlement. I mean, the global calculation that we have is from development-based displacement. Only about 20 to 25% people are given resettlement, and that also is very far away from their original place of livelihood. And I can tell you about my city. Our experience is that in the last 5 years, there must have been 400,000 people evicted around the city. Out of that, only about 18 to 20% were given resettlement. That also very far away. And many of the people who were evicted came back to the city because that's where their livelihood is. And because of those evictions, directly as a result of that, the homelessness population in Delhi has grown. We have something like 200,000 people homeless right now, because there was no policy of ensuring that people who were displaced were adequately resettled. There are other evictions, rural evictions. It's very hard to track where people go. I mean, some people migrate to cities, other people migrate to other rural areas. It's very difficult to track that, and no attempt has really been made to track that. The only way is you have to work backwards. So if you go into a slum, you have to ask people, well, where did you come from? And it becomes very complicated, because I'll give you an example from the city of Colombo in Sri Lanka. We did some work there, and asked people, and some people came because they were evicted because of the tsunami. Some were evicted because of the conflict in the country. Some were evicted because of development projects. So everybody is sort of put together into. So that work has not really been done, of mapping those types of movements. It has been for conflict, but not for. Sorry.
It just seems ironic in the case where you would argue that these evictions need to take place to promote progress and modernization, when you're increasing homelessness, for example, which is not any sort of progress.
That's right, yeah, but governments don't see it like that. They see it as, I think you know about the evictions that have happened historically in China. I mean, if you look at what happened in Shanghai, what happened in Beijing, entire urban villages were cleared. And now the government there feels, well, we have world-class cities, we have great cities, we have booming economy. So that human impact is not has to be impressed upon people. That you cannot say that you have made progress. Exactly what you're saying, if you have increased homelessness.
You were saying that part of the challenge was to not just document violations, but name the violators. I was wondering who would be doing that naming, or who are you referring to when you say naming violators? Are these NGOs that will be doing kind of the mobilizing, or are these UN bodies that will be doing this? And is it tricky to do? Is it politically complicated? Maybe give me an example.
I know there's different bodies. There are NGOs that are saying that this official was responsible. There are UN bodies that do it. There are courts where evidence is presented before the court, and the court actually calls that official, if he or she is a commissioner of a municipality, they call them before and say what is going on, right? So there are, I can give you many examples of very senior officials that have been named. But the problem is, naming is difficult, still possible. But prosecuting it's a bit like the economic crisis, right? No one was able to prosecute the bankers. Why not? Why is there this halo around people who we know were directly responsible for the crisis? So similarly for this, if somebody had committed a murder or was even involved in large-scale corruption, people are prosecuted, right, if they're found out and there's evidence. But for these types of things, it's very hard to get prosecutions, and that's something to think about. So.
I was wondering, actually, having done some reading on this subject, I've come across a few mentions, I guess, of instances where a government, I suppose, was actually willing to compensate the people that were displaced. I remember reading about something in Japan where farmers were displaced and were actually given quality arable land. So I'm wondering if it's worth considering also the flip side of it. I realize that those are very contextually contingent examples, but I'm wondering if you could maybe comment on what the arrangements are like that would allow those kinds of partnerships to happen. And has there been anything within the guidelines that it's sort of in conversation with those sort of more successful cases?
Well, yeah, if you follow the guidelines and you have to do the resettlement after having run through all the safeguards, then it is possible. It's possible to resettle people. It's possible. As I mentioned, there are many cases where you have to do it. And even if you're clearing a large slum and there's very high density, and even if you say you want to upgrade people there, you will not be able to upgrade everyone. So some people will have to be moved. Right? So there are situations where it can be done, but it has to be done in a certain rights-based manner, right? And that's what the question is. Is it done like that? And were the people actually satisfied with the resettlement?
So I've got a question about these guidelines, specifically in relation to the settlement expansion issue in the West Bank.
Right.
And obviously that's one of the biggest things about eviction. And in the recent industrial review process, have these guidelines had any weight at all in the advocacy against that process? Or in general, has this been used
against the Israeli settlements in the bank?
And the eviction
in the West Bank? Not that I'm aware of. No. They have not been used. I mean, they're available to all the people who are working on that. I actually did a mission there in UN Special Rapporteur, and there are a lot of recommendations. It was before the guidelines were adopted, but the UN agencies have taken certain aspects out of that and used them, but they haven't been used in their entirety. That would be an interesting.
Yes, because I'm wondering why do you think that is? Because that's one of the most sort of contemporary eviction issues, and people are grappling with anything really to advocate.
Well, there I think you have a larger question. The international standards are generally being ignored. Right? I mean, you have a whole range of Security Council, other resolutions. You have, nothing is being followed in that, and there's no. The states, getting the sort of political discussion, the countries that can stop Israel from doing that are not actually doing it. Right? So there are a lot of other issues around that, and then also it's a sort of a gray area, and I don't mean that in a negative sense, because is it sort of democratic type of situation? Is it a conflict situation? Is it post-conflict? Is it, so there are a lot of, it's a very sort of complex area that needs to be looked at. So which guidelines apply? Do you use the IDP guidelines? Do you use eviction guidelines? So there is but there are groups, there are housing rights groups. There's a Palestinian housing rights campaign that has drafted a declaration called the Jerusalem Declaration on the Right to Housing, where they're using the guidelines. There's other groups that are working. B'Tselem is aware of them, but it's a larger context, which is okay. We'll move to the. How much time do we have? Okay, so you saw that in the guidelines there is a call for an eviction impact assessment instrument, a tool. And obviously the guidelines are not the place where you could actually expand on what that tool would look like. How would we reach, and what would be the content of that tool, and how would it be used? What would it essentially look like? So after the guidelines were adopted in 2007, the Housing and Land Rights Networks, the group I work with, we decided to actually take that legitimacy of that tool from the UN guidelines and develop them. And so now we have reached a process where we have an instrument, so that I'm going to share with you today. And it's being field tested in a number of countries, and the results of that findings are being used in different places. So I'll just introduce the tool to you. So again, this is a reiteration of what we were talking about earlier, that the guidelines call for eviction impact assessment to be conducted before carrying out a project. There's a need to determine real costs, need to look at material and non-material impacts, look at differential impact, and have disaggregated data on different types of communities, with the hope, of course, that if we can capture the enormity of the damage, we would also be able to prevent evictions or ensure adequate rehabilitation and resettlement. So this is a little bit more on the. It's just repeating the actual phrasing of the that are in the guidelines. Disaggregation, and again, it follows the same typology that you should be able to carry out an eviction impact assessment before, during, and after displacement. So the sort of basis, of course, is that you need to have a baseline survey, inventory of assets that are under threat. This is in cases where you know that the community is going to be evicted, but so you carry out an eviction impact assessment before. Then you can make an assessment once if the community receives a notice. Eviction notice, and of course possibilities of assessments post-eviction in the places where people have been either resettled, by the authorities, or have found their own areas of living, or are essentially on the street because they were evicted. So the baseline survey is based on these types of calculations: economic assets, household expenditures, social assets of the household, civic assets, and as I mentioned, we're also looking at public and state expenditure. What does it actually cost the authorities in terms of bulldozers, police, bureaucratic costs, everything. That's usually never done, never calculated cost of the project. And this goes to that other point I was raising earlier, that actually it costs less to upgrade people readily rather than displace them and then resettle them somewhere else. So the baseline is just a so these are the types of economic assets that need to be looked at, and it is possible with the tool that we have now to we worked out ways in which you can make these types of calculations. What would the losses be for? And of course, I should mention the idea of the tool. It's a sort of a generic framework. So in all the test cases that we've done, you had to adapt it. You had to simplify it. You have to, there are parts that are missing. Like if you use it in a rural context, we recently did a test case in the state of Orissa in an agricultural area, and when we did a initial round discussions with the villagers, they added lots of things that we hadn't even thought about. Particular kinds of tools, the sort of things that for them are very important. So they have to be adapted. But this captures the range of. Then there are other household costs. And another very important aspect that's often left out are social assets. So for example, if a community was existing for 20 years, they had built a community center, they had created other networks. So can you actually cost that? You should be able to, because you are, by evicting, you are destroying. Then you have social assets like if a family is evicted from their home and they had the rights to that home, or didn't, you have inheritance costs that would be lost for the children. They're moved somewhere else. And a more difficult part is, what's below is the psychological aspect. So we've been consulting with doctors, with insurance people, with others to see if you can put, some kind of either a figure or some sense of what is lost. A very common example is what I gave you about child's education. If a child loses a year's education, can you calculate what that loss would be? And these are done typically in sort of this type of format. So there are different things, and usually what is used is the market value. So if let's say you had a television that was destroyed, you don't calculate the value of what it was when it was bought, but what it would cost for you to replace it, right? So that's. There are other more difficult. When we started doing this, it's incredible how many things came up in terms of loss. So there are also civic assets that are lost, and you need to capture that. Then I mentioned the public costs. These are the areas where government has to actually spend time. And then we have the costs during evictions, which also possible to look at what is lost during the eviction if it's not carried out in a humane manner. So what are the types of immediate losses that are there? One of the worst losses that we have found is our identity documents. People lose their Russian cards, their election IDs, their passports if they have them, and we've also been able to calculate if you lost your passport, for example, what does it cost to replace it? How much, you know, of your time of labor do you lose? How many bureaucratic fees did you have to pay bribes to get it back? So that is also possible to do, but very difficult to recover some of the costs. And the social aspects similar to the before. Similarly, the public, when you have post-eviction losses, this is not a very good photograph because it's an IDP camp, so it's sort of a post-conflict situation. But in a development-based situation, you wouldn't have this kind of order. It's completely chaotic. People are everywhere. So losses after in a post-eviction situation, what kind of costs do people have to go through when they are in a resettlement area or in an area which they've established themselves. So it's following that line of the baseline survey essentially. And, so this is the site where we've recently done a very detailed eviction impact assessment. It's a place called Valjit Nagar in Delhi where evictions took place, and we were able to go to court and have the eviction stopped, but part of the community was evicted. So we then did an extensive way, and we sat with the community, we simplified the tool, listed out, you can see the types of contents in the household in detail, we costed them, and then we found, of course, that there were all these violations that had taken place. And sorry, yes?
Use that tool with that community, do you do it with every single member that was there, or you kind of do a sample size, or?
No, in this case, the first eviction that took place, there were about 65 families that were evicted. So we did everybody. But of course, but every family. But normally in a large eviction situation, you would have to take a sample, and you have to do the focus group discussions. You have to, so if you do it in a resettlement site, you just have to make it representative so that you capture people who come from different places. You talk to women, you talk to the elderly. So you have to do that kind of a methodology. Yeah. But what I was saying before is that we all need help in terms of doing bigger surveys. And ideally, it would be good to survey everybody, right? But it's not always possible.
Sorry, this might be jumping the gun a little bit, but what about issues of cost and scale? In other words, you were doing it maybe with a sample, not with every single person, but who was funding this project? And I was wondering, maybe later you want to comment a little bit
Sure.
on the feasibility of scaling up that kind of research. Angel.
We're hoping MIT will carry some of the burden. No. So when we did this extensive impact assessment, we did an analysis of all the data, and we found out that on an average, the average family who lost a home in this Valjit Nagar demolition suffered at a minimum the loss of access to housing and shelter, loss of documentation. Many of them actually had security of tenure. They had the right to stay there. There was significant reduction in access to livelihood. They were evicted. Many of them lost their daily wages. The substantial reduction in monthly spending on food. Now, why this happened, I'll just come back to that. An increase in expenses related, for example, to access water. They have to actually buy water from that time onwards. A substantial rise in injuries and expenses related to health, both as a direct result of demolition, because the demolition was, some of it was violent and people were actually injured, but also because of the tension, the kind of exacerbation and the pressure situation which led to creation of chronic conditions. There were actually a number of elderly men who had heart attacks, which would be directly related to. There's a loss of education for children and the destruction of numerous assets and possessions. So if you look, I'll just give you a little more detail on two of the issues. When we talk about loss of access to housing and shelter, so a number of families completely lost their homes because the homes were, as you saw in the photograph, were sort of razed to the ground. And since housing represented a significant portion of the assets that the people were holding, it led to a substantial loss of wealth. And of course of the security, right, health and property security. And we have figures of how we were able to calculate that, including the loss of the property that was in the house. Most households lost at least one document required to prove their eligibility, even if they had to be resettled. You need to prove that you were there, you had some kind of identity. And then, as I mentioned before, the monetary costs and implications of the loss of these documents is significant, and needs to be factored into any kind of assessment. What was very interesting was the food. As I mentioned, the food expenses were the reduction in the monthly expenditure, and this happened in a situation where people are already poor. And the drop can be attributed to an increase in other expenditures. So once you're evicted, you need whatever household funds you have, you need them for healthcare, to buy water, to get temporary shelter somewhere. So then you don't have enough money left over for food. But this has very serious consequences, because we found that the drastic decrease in the food consumption was particularly harmful for everybody, but particularly for pregnant, lactating women, for children who there was a series of illnesses that they faced higher risk of anemia, malnutrition, and often irreversible damages to their health. So this data that was then, this analysis that was done was presented in the High Court in Delhi, and the case is still going on. The court has actually stopped the eviction for now, and we are hoping that this assessment will actually convince the judges to issue an order permanently cancelling the project, the eviction project. So this has been done. This exercise has been done in a number of places, and people have, groups have themselves come up with recommendations using that and learning about their rights, learning about how much they've lost, and getting over the fact that some people still have this mentality that, oh, if the government is doing it, what can we do? We have to move on with our lives. But this actually gave them the confidence to accept it as it would be an issue of the violation of their rights and the wrongdoing of the government. So people have come up with very detailed recommendations based on these assessments of what they would like the government to do and what type of compensation they would like to have. So
for that project in Miloon, what was the government's reason for eviction? Was it a development project? Or?
Yeah, they said that they need the land to build a fire station or something. It wasn't, but it's very clear from what has happened in the neighborhood that it's become sort of prime land, so they probably want to use it for. And in many cases around the world now, we can actually see when you do a post-eviction assessment that either the land is left vacant or it's been given over for some private purpose. So it's essentially using using public purpose for private purpose. You had another question?
No, just, yeah, using that sort of health and well-being, public good basis, but sort of sitting on that and then transferring those rights to
Yeah.
people on private property.
Restitution list. So here's just a very quick run through how you can use a tool like that. Research, documentation, it's very useful in the media to expose the damage that is done. As I mentioned, it can be used legal defense, used to argue for better compensation, used to argue for a change in policy so that the next time, similar things are not done. So you can actually, several of these impact assessments can lead to even a change in the master planning process. They can lead to a change in the type of development policies that governments have at the city level. They can provide examples of alternative ways to plan communities, different ways to conduct project implementation, social mobilization, of course, enforcing international obligations. Yeah, so that's it. So this is new, it's just happened. We are, the first 6 test cases have been done just in the last 6 months and in different countries for different situations, not only development based. We also looked at one ethnic conflict situation. We looked at one community that was lost their homes because of floods. We looked at another community that is being evicted because of expansion of an airport, of the airport in Mumbai. So there are different we're looking at, but largely it's been designed for development-based situations. But we've already found that it's very useful for other types of displacement as well. Thanks very much.
Something that you mentioned today and also discussed briefly on Tuesday is the importance of shifting to in situ upgrading as the main emphasis of dealing, especially with informal settlements in urban settlements. And something that seems to predominate in the discussion around evictions is the role of compensation in evictions.
Right.
Where that seems to imply that as long as people are compensated properly, whatever that means, and it usually just gets translated into individualized and financial terms,
right.
Then the development is fine. And it seems like the broader impact that we're looking for is not just to get people who better compensation when they get pushed out of the way, but it's to ensure that they don't get pushed out of the way in the first place.
That's right.
And so something that I'm still trying to work through is how can you use a tool like this or other tools to shift that part of the conversation? Because here in the second to last slide, I guess compensation is still one of the big issues that comes out of using this tool.
Well, the first thing is that if you look at the guidelines, the hidden agenda of the guidelines is essentially to minimize evasion. So if you give, the guidelines call for everyone who is threatened currently with being displaced, you first give them their housing rights, you give them, you explore alternatives, which means alternatives means you explore alternatives to displacement. So if you run through all the preventative and before eviction requirements of the guidelines, if actually compensation only comes in if all of that is satisfied. And then if government is really able to show that the displacement has to occur. So compensation is of course an important aspect, but it's much further down the line. And as I was saying before, we do have situations where people will have to be moved, for health and reasons. And if that happens, sure that they're adequately compensated. So compensation, it's not, I mean, if you follow the logic of the guidelines, it's not at all saying that if you have adequate compensation, you can go ahead with displacement. So the rights part is only in exceptional circumstances can people be referred.
So this tool is about assessing the impact on the effect that immediately affected people, but
no, it's also a preventative tool. Remember what I was saying before, that you can suppose a community is threatened. Right? Suppose you're living in a city and you know that 30% of the people don't have rights to where they're living. That at one point or another they're going to be displaced. So you carry out an extensive eviction impact assessment, and you use that evidence to actually argue your point that it's better to upgrade these people than to evict them. And the social consequence of eviction, how, the enormity of that, you try to capture that in the tool. So essentially the tool can be used at every level. But if an eviction is going ahead, and if communities have already been evicted, like today, you have people who have been evicted or living in very poor conditions, then again the tool can be used to show the damage that has already been done, for which they have to be compensated, including the possibility of going back if the land is still vacant.
so does that include, like, let's say the example of the Mumbai airport slum?
Right.
Is there kind of a citywide impact assessment of the eviction of the people who are living near the airport? Like, does it include, this is the contribution of the people who are living in these settlements near the airport to the citywide economy, let's say? So kind of, because that seems like a key aspect of making a broader argument against eviction and for institute upgrading. There's the human people within the settlement itself, and everyone in the city who's benefiting from having those people.
You mean how through their labor they are contributing
For
to the
example,
city?
yeah.
No, that's not there, but yeah, that's a good idea. We should do that. No, it's not there right now. That's actually, think about it. How would you do that? So, because even if they move this, they can still continue to contribute, right? So it's better to look at the other side, which is if they are moved, they would lose that. Not only would they lose their income, but that the city would lose their contribution. Right? Maybe that's not a better way of looking at it then. But thanks for that. I'll give it a try.
I'm sorry I got here a little bit late, but I have a comment on that, on his comment, and also a question. So I could imagine this tool being used, for instance, in Brazil,
Right.
where I'm from there, so I work with land regularization and slum operating for 10 years. I'm visiting a
Okay.
student this year here. So actually I really wanted to see it complete, but I couldn't. So I think this tool is being used already, and it can be used further on when you are when people have the right to stay there already as well, and how you can argue with the judge to postpone and to ensure they're going to be settled, but also in the way you make project, the urban upgrading project, because after you start making the project, there are always people who are going to be displaced anyway. And at least in our standards in Brazil, we do like 30, 40, until 50% displacement when you put infrastructure and so this is a very good tool for advocating for different kind of projects, approach of displacement and so on. And my question is also looking at our example, displacement would be always socially accepted by, it was like an evolution of reasons to evict. In the beginning you would say, okay, it's illegal, it's okay to evict. And then it was becoming every time more difficult. And what we have now there is like risk being a very much used as an argument for displacement. So the real interest is not getting people safer, but risk as an excuse. So I would ask you what are the main reasons
and how are they being socially accepted around?
But by risk you mean, the argument is that if people are left where they are,
No,
it's
no,
a
I
risk
mean,
for their health
No,
or for the city or
for-
I mean, crime is one issue that is a
No,
big thing in.
like
in
risk
the-
of sliding or risk
Oh,
of
yeah, in of
this
course,
kind
of course,
risk.
yeah. But that's again an argument for, so they have a right to resettle, but you have to make sure that they're adequately resettled, right? And
Actually,
that
my
they-
question was more like, because we had in Brazil like an evolution of the socially acceptable
yes.
argument, and they have the right to stay and everything, but when it seems like when all these arguments are gone, like are exhausted, they are inventing new arguments. So infrastructure is not so accessible anymore because it can have other possibilities, but then they're using a lot of risk and risk of fire, risk of sliding, risk of floating. But actually, if you look at the whole city, many places have the same risk.
Sure.
But that's why it's a ideological argument, and I would like to ask you how you see that in other places.
I think it's a couple of things. One is whether there are consultations with the communities and what does the community feel. Do they, feel that they need to be in better conditions? The second is that if you have a citywide plan, you have to have master plans have that, right? Say you project what the city will look like in 15 years, 20 years. And what does that say? And was that again done in consultation with people? I think in the long run, people who are living in these type of situations should be resettled. You cannot take a position that, because it is a risk to their health, it is a risk. But the question is, will they be resettled so far away that they lose whatever access to services that they have right now? So it's a dialogue question, I think. But certainly, if it would be great if you can use this in Brazil. I don't think the guidelines are available in Portuguese, but the tool is not. So if you have contacts, people want to use, particularly in Rio, it would be very useful. We have sent it. My successor is Brazilian, as you know.
Yep.
The new rapporteur is Raquel Romero. She's using the guidelines, but no, I don't think the tool yet. So if you want to
Yeah, I think so.
take it back.
We could
Thanks.
do it.
I'm kind of curious as to how this tool has been disseminated thus far. Housing Landrights Network has partners around the world. Is that basically the primary mechanism?
Yeah, it's through. Well, we haven't yet officially launched it. We're still sort of final stages of refining it. But it is available to. The form in which I have shown it, it's not yet there on the website, but we will be putting it on the website. But we are looking for partners. We recently had discussions with UN Habitat and the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, and they're all very interested in partnering. So at some stage during this year, we would like to launch it as a, globally available tool that people can use and modify. And if this, as this eviction network here at MIT goes forward, I think it's going to be one of the instruments that will be used. I hope. Okay, thanks very much.